Hi, Constanza. How you doing?
Hi, Adam. Thanks. Doing fine. How about you?
I'm not too bad. I'm not too bad. Well, thank you for taking part in Leonid Lounge, our podcast series. As some people may know, I lead the human rights function here at Leonid, and we're very lucky to be joined here by Constanza Baeriswyl, the former global head of human rights at Sandoz. I appreciate you taking the time, Constanza. I suppose this podcast really is just an opportunity for us to educate our market, educate our customer base as well on human rights issues. I think from our perspective, we consistently see businesses that are uneducated around human rights. So, I mean, would you mind giving us an understanding of, I suppose, the human rights landscape and why human rights is so important in business?
Yeah, for sure. So first, thanks, Adam, for the invitation. Also, thanks to Leonid for this opportunity. And yeah, let's start with why human rights is important for business, right?
Mm.
So there's many kind of arguments that you can use. However, I want to be very practical and consistent with business operation. It's important for business operation, let's say, okay? Because when you have human rights violation, you relied in, like, imagine a company that rely on a very complex supply chain. Okay.
Okay.
So if you have any human rights violation at any stage of your supply chain, I'm not speaking about direct supply, I'm speaking also like in the indirect supply chain, you might have operational disruption because
Mm.
any human rights violation can result in labor strike, community protests, supply chain disruption, and that will, of course, affect negatively your business
Mm.
operations. That is one, like for operational reason, it's already important for companies. Okay. Then we have expectations, let's say, from governance, from investors about the respect of human rights from companies. In governance, not every governance, but we have examples in UK, in Germany, in France, in Australia, Norway, Switzerland, Canada. So many of them are expecting companies to conduct human rights due diligence and to respect human rights, to identify risks and to identify impacts and to remediate. There is an expectation there. Also, when it comes to investors, there is an expectation there. Many investors take ESG related data to make investors' decisions. They are
Mhm.
also like trying to understand what are the efforts of the company to respect human rights. And they will, of course, take that in consideration. So companies that want to rely and have access to capital, I would say that it's better to comply with human rights legislation and also with this of the investors. And I would say finally,
Mm.
when it comes to consumers' expectation or consumers' preference, has been seen the last year, especially in the young generation, that they prefer brands and they prefer products that come from brands and companies that respect environmental and human rights, let's say, topics or impact, that they have a plan, that they have a strategy, that they have an ESG report. So they actually prefer to buy in those brands than in others that do not have this kind of strategy. And finally, I would say that it's important for companies, maybe not companies that are in the European Union, but also companies from outside the European Union. If you respect human rights, if you have a plan, if you have a strategy, it will be easy for you to enter the European market. I see that in many companies and in many suppliers of European companies that they say, oh, this doesn't apply to us, right? We don't have that law.
Yeah.
And I say, yeah, I know, I completely understand. It's not a legal requirement for you, but it's a legal requirement for us. So let's start implementation better now than late, because if you already have this implement, your next negotiation with a next, let's say, European company, it will be just easier to do it because you will have already all the processes in place. So I think like for non-European company, it's also a must when they want to enter new markets and have
Absolutely.
more clients, let's say.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, Leonid works very globally. We've got a lot of clients in America as well as that kind of EMEA European Union where that regulation is very strong. And even our American clients are, the more progressive ones I think there is certainly an education piece around, yes, that you are not necessarily directly bound by this legislation, but yeah, from a business standpoint, you do need to be engaging with regulators and understanding that regulation,
Yeah, for
and
sure.
especially around human rights. That, I suppose, yeah, that consumer pressure, that investor pressure as well is growing, which is encouraging.
If you think
But
about, like, for example, the war in Ukraine and Russia, the civil society pressure and the consumer pressure about many brands leaving operation in Russia because they didn't want to finance human rights violation was big. So, like, civil society and consumers are like pushing and pressure companies to make a statement on human rights, to see where are they, like, want to protect or want to finance, or what kind of it's very tricky because normally companies do not have like a political statement, but the civil society is like are putting a lot of pressure in companies.
absolutely, and I suppose with that growing sphere of data as well, that's kind of feeding how well informed investors are, and as well, and
Yes.
consumers as well. That pressure, I'm hoping that continues to snowball and grow. Absolutely, and I suppose that you did mention one other thing around those kind of pillars, I suppose, in the growing importance of human rights, and that was the regulation. Obviously, there's a lot of domestic legislation coming out, but I mean, what would you say is the most important regulations that businesses either in the EU or globally need to be looking out for?
We have many regulations.
Yeah.
Like it's overwhelming the amount of regulation that we have today at the moment for companies. But let's say to make it simple, we have three. We can classify the regulation in three pillars. Let's say first we have all the international standards. Here you can find the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights. That it's not mandatory for company, but it's the starting point of
Yes.
business and human rights. Then we have the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprise that also it's not mandatory, but also like it's a very good guidelines, especially for multinational enterprise. And then we have the core convention from the International Labor Organization about labor rights that give you all the standards that you as a company or has to follow when it comes to labor rights. Then we have a bunch of national legislation that we can also like see. They're like the same but different at the same time.
Okay.
So we have modern slavery legislation in UK, Australia, Canada. Then we have Transparency Act in California and also like in Norway. Both of them are very focused in due diligence and reporting and transparency, but they have like slightly kind of difference, but they're focused like in modern slavery, human traffic, transparency, reporting, have different names, but at the end of the day are like, if you think as a company, you have to have the same management system, okay? Also like to identify the risk and also to address it. Then we have some laws that are more focused on child labor due diligence. Here we find Switzerland and also Holland that the main point is like conduct due diligence on operations, supply chain, but very focused on child labor to identify if you have any child labor in the supply chain and have a plan also to remediate in case you find any child labor. Then we have, for example, in Switzerland, conflict mineral law that are focused also child labor, forced labor, in serious human rights violation, but just in the conflict, let's say, in the mineral supply chain. So it's very specific for minerals and child labor, forced labor. But then we have other kind of legal legislation, like in France and Germany, that are broader. They have like a broader scope. It's human rights and environmental due diligence, so not just human rights, also environmental, in all your operation and your direct supply chain, and sometimes under certain requirements in your indirect supply chain. So you need to take in consideration not just forced labor, child labor, also freedom of association, non-discrimination, environmental impact, and many other things. So include all the labor rights pretty much, okay? So this is like Germany and France. And now from the European Union, we have many other kind of regulation. First, the capital market legislation with the non-financial reporting directive and the UE taxonomy regulation that is very financial market related, not like for any kind of company. But we have also very specific regulation that applies for a specific topic. Conflict minerals, forced labor regulation, and then non-deforestation free product regulation as well. So this is our for specific topic. And the game changers will come next year and the years after that with the corporate sustainability reporting directive that will apply to pretty much all the European companies. It doesn't matter the size anymore or how much money do you make at the end of the year as a company. It will apply, of course, in stage from 2025 to 2029. So it will start with the large company, but then we will apply to the SMEs, so smaller and medium enterprise, and also for non-European parent companies. So if you are not a European company, but you are a parent company of a subsidiary in Europe, will apply to you in 2029 anyway. So as a company, let's say a US company, right? They are like headquarters in the US, but they have affiliate here and subsidiary here in Europe. Will apply to the US US parent company as well. And the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, it's about reporting, and it's very strict about the KPIs that you have to report and what you have to report and what you have to do. Like the directive put a lot of emphasis in reporting, but we know without implementation, we cannot report. You know, like a lot of people say, like, it's just a report every year. Yeah, but if you don't implement, if you don't have the processes, then it's very likely that you don't have anything to report. And the other game changers, it's coming from the European Sustainability Due Diligence Directive.
Yes, the CSDDD.
Yes, CSDDD. Very trendy at the moment, I have to say. And this one will come into force also starting in 2027 to 2029. So, and this one put the emphasis in due diligence. So has certain due diligence obligation that you have to follow as a company. Do not put the emphasis in just in the reporting, let's say, strategy. It's more about like you have to have processes in place to identify human rights and environmental impact, risk, address the impact, have a grievance mechanism, remediate in case of impact. So it's like the entire due diligence exercise that will be mandatory for European company. And with the time as well, as you know, if it's mandatory, as I said, if it's mandatory for a European company, will be with the time also mandatory for the entire supply chain, as the European company is obliged to conduct due diligence in the supply chain. So
that kind of far more holistic view as opposed to CSRD being that kind of structure, that reporting mechanism, whereas CS3D or Triple D will come in with far more strategic and in-depth, I suppose, human rights due diligence practices.
Yeah, if you think about like next year, you already have to report, European companies, large ones, already have to report under the reporting directive. So, and have to report this year. So the implementation of this year is key to have at least one first good report about like what you implement this year and all the KPIs. And it's very strict about what you have to report and how you have to report it. So yeah, you have to be prepared. And of course, each legislation, it's pretty much about like all the legislation that we have at the moment. However, as a company, not all of them will apply to your operation and your supply chain. So the first thing that you have to do as a company is to identify, map your operation, map your supply chain, and identify which of those laws will be applicable for your operation and also for your suppliers. That's the first step. But these two at the European level are like game changer of that kind of mapping, you know, because at the end of the day, let's say in 5 years, it will be pretty much mandatory even though that you don't have operation in Europe, for example.
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, talking about that reporting versus strategic, and I suppose that timeline, we're seeing a lot of businesses that are hiring specifically for CSRDs, or kind of broader human rights roles that focus on that, and anticipating CS3D or triple D as well. I think, yeah, there is I suppose, the businesses that we see that are educated on this subject, that understand their obligations, are certainly hiring in these places and really building out robust systems, because for a lot of businesses, those reporting guidelines or those regulations are coming in, as you said, very, very soon. And those deadlines are coming in, that analysis is already here and necessary. So yeah, it certainly is a time to be thinking very, very heavily around human rights, especially from a regulatory side. So I appreciate you going through those regulations. And I suppose, speaking about those businesses that have different outlooks, maybe, or different expectations of what human rights is in their business. I mean, in your experience, common practices, mistakes, do you see a lot of those in human rights within businesses, or have you come across any that really stand out for you that you'd like to maybe educate other businesses on?
Yes, I think I can understand that this is a difficult topic for companies, because it's let's say a new one. And I think the first thing that a company has to do when they think about I want to implement a human rights strategy, or I want to have a sustainability kind of team, is not to do this alone. This is the first. So it's not that isolating kind of exercise. You have to understand where you are. Let's say mapping, operation, this kind of things.
Yes.
But also coming back to your industry. If you belong to the mining industry, if you belong to the pharma industry, to the textile industry, you have to do that with your industry, because it's not the same. You don't have the same kind of risk. You don't have you have the same, pretty much, the supplier. So you have to do it with your peers, because this is the best way to have a good strategy, to have a good human rights practice, because you don't have to create this from nothing. You have to see what your peers are doing and participate with them in initiative. There's many around there that you are let's say, part of this. You have a membership in this initiative, and you can see what others are doing, how they are doing, and also follow the guidelines of the initiative, because they already figured out how to do it. They are been in the market for already 10 years. Let's say, for example, if we consider pharma, you have the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative that has more than, I think, 80 already membership associate of different pharma around the world, that they have different law that apply to them. But then you have the pharma guidelines. And once you follow those guidelines and you ask your supplier to follow those guidelines, it's very easy to implement, because it's not something that you create from nothing or base in nothing. That it's one of the things that I would recommend any company. Go to your peers, ask them what they are doing, how they are doing, and then replicate that. It will save you time, resources, everything, pretty much, because they already figured out how to do it. The other thing that you can do and that you have to do is to involve people inside the company. It's not really an isolate kind of exercise. You have to identify the risk in your company. You have to ask your employees. You have to ask the local communities. You have to ask human rights organizations. They will tell you what are your risks. They will tell you, because you can. Normally, company will say, we don't have any human rights issue. That's the first.
Get that line all the time. Yeah.
we don't have any human rights issue. Ask your local community. Ask the community surrounding of your manufacturing site. Do they have any contamination, like noises or whatever? That is the people who will be impacted. That is the impact people. And that's why you need to involve also your suppliers. You cannot do it without your suppliers. You cannot just create a guidelines for your suppliers without knowing who are your suppliers, in which kind of country they are. Do they have the capacity to implement this or not? Mm-hmm. If not, at the end of the day, if you put certain standard and you just send a code of conduct to your suppliers, you will be without suppliers at the end of the year, because they cannot meet those standards. It's impossible for them. because it's completely different when you treat suppliers from, let's say, Latin America, Asia, and supplier in the US. They have like a different culture. They have different legal frameworks. Something that it's legal in China, it's not legal in Mexico. So it's very difficult to standardize this kind of thing. So you need to involve them to understand how, because like diversity is not the same in each country. So if you impose kind of a diversity kind of standard in your company, you need to also consider the cultural difference. So you need to involve those suppliers and understand them before you just send a code of conduct, for example.
I'd never considered that actually, that dissonance, I suppose, between this, this overarching human rights legislation, which, personally, I'm all for it. I love it. But that dissonance between that and then maybe domestic laws that focus on employment, that focus on all of these, and then obviously then influence the culture in a country when they look at employment, when they look at workers' rights.
Yes.
And I suppose, the setting those standards, something that, workers' rights in Germany or in Switzerland may be completely different to, as you've said, in Honduras or Guatemala or places like that. So, I'd never considered that before.
You learn that with practice. You get so much pushback from any country saying, but for us it's legal. And say, yeah, it's legal. I know, but do not meet this European standard. I'm so sorry. Let's try to figure out how we try to increase a little bit the standards so we can work with you, because I know in your country this is a legal kind of thing that you do or a cultural thing that you do, but unfortunately we cannot work with suppliers with this kind of practice, let's say.
And do you think that the European legislation, or the CSRD, CS3D, what that's imposing, because it has that weight of being European, do you think that would have more effect than maybe the LKSG in Germany or other legislation domestically?
I would say yes. I think that what works for me is to communicate very well why we are doing this, why we are asking them to improve, and also like this kind of things of, if you implement now, you will have more chances in the future to close deals with European company, because there's something that it's coming from everybody. So it will spread at some point, and in the practice, you get this kind of rejection or pushback because they have just different practice that sometimes you can consider those practices not really in compliance with the human rights standard that the Europeans are expecting to have in their supply chain, right? So it's tricky, but I think, and that's why you have to do it with your peers, because they supply you and they supply your peers as well, your competitor, let's say. So if you do it as an industry, if you collaborate together with this, then it's easy also to implement, because you have the same suppliers at the end. A very complex same suppliers, because it's in another level or another tier. One supplier can be direct supplier to your competitor and indirect supplier to you. But at the end of the day, what it's important is that you can convince your supplier and support them in a better way to implement any standard that they have to implement.
Absolutely, yeah, that carrot, not a stick mentality. You'll be more attractive to European purchasers, maybe, or consumers at the top of that kind of supply chain, rather than those people at the bottom. Absolutely.
Yes. And the other mistake that I see sometimes is this is a big mistake for a company, that they use also environmental and social compliance, let's say, as a public relation or marketing tool. They claim sometimes to be sustainable, for example, environmental sustainable, social sustainable. But when you check a little bit, just a little bit, like a consumer, if they check a little bit, they are just claiming that based on just one KPI, for example, that they have paper instead of plastic in the product, whatever. So they claim being sustainable, but they don't have any processes in place. They don't conduct due diligence. They don't know who their suppliers are. There's no transparency. So I think that it's a big mistake that I see some companies to do it, because that has a very bad brand reputation at the end of the day.
Mm.
If you use it just as a marketing tool, let's say, and focus on just one thing, that you have paper instead of plastic, and claim to be sustainable just based on that, it's not good business. It's like, it's not good business.
Absolutely, and I think what we saw that, I suppose there was a brief wave. It would have been nice if it was a bigger wave of kind of greenwashing allegations that were made against a number of different companies.
Yes.
And do you feel like that will grow with especially in human rights? Do you think that will grow with people calling out human rights abuses in the
Oh,
supply chain?
well, they say social washing now.
Social
So,
washing, there we
yeah,
go.
social washing. When you claim to be that you respect human rights and you have all the processes in place, and at the end of the day, you don't have anything, you don't know your suppliers, and people neglect sometimes the human rights risk in the supply chain. I would say sometimes just because most of the time they neglect about, we don't have any issue, as I said. Because they don't have the processes. When you have the processes, you are able to identify. If you don't have any risk analysis, you will not be able to identify. You cannot claim that you don't have any issue in the supply chain if you don't conduct a risk analysis about your supply chain. The same in own operation. You cannot claim that you don't have any issues if you haven't conducted a human rights analysis of your own operation, identify what are the risks and the impact. After that exercise, I think like, okay, then you can claim it and say,
Yes.
then it's not social washing.
Here is our own
right?
independent research. This
Yes.
is how we justify it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And,
Well, yeah, I'll be
and I
looking
would
out for more
say
social washing.
social washing, yeah, that's a new word, I would say.
Yeah.
But it claims finally the same as environmental washing, right? Greenwashing, that you
Yeah.
claim something that it's not there. And finally, I would say that the another mistake that I see in the implementation is the poor integration with the business operation. So you have like an isolated kind of human rights team, for example, and then you have the ESG team in a company, and they report differently. They report ESG criteria, and the others like just human rights criteria, but they're not, they don't have too much in common sometimes, or
Yeah.
they have like different KPIs. And also then you have the risk management team of the company, and they say that they have risk in here and there and bribery, but they're not really integrated as a company. So as a company, you cannot really say like, these are all risks, like can be environmental, bribery, or whatever, like more compliance driven or more ESG driven. You need to have, let's say, has to be consistent when you report as a company. So when you have isolated teams that not integrate the data and also like the risk aspect of the company, then you have like many risks that are not real. Also, like you are saying like, oh, we have maybe a risk on discrimination or a free association kind of things, but you have to compare that risk as a company also with other risks in anti-bribery, corruption, also environmental topics. So like the poor integration also make a human rights strategy like weak, very weak, because at the end of the day, will not have any impact in the business operations.
I think we've seen, I suppose, a mix of how businesses structure their human rights programs. Do they integrate it in more of a strategic approach, or do they, because of the, I suppose, the amount of legislation that's come out, do they treat it as a compliance topic, as a more of a, I suppose, a legal risk, and deal with it in that way? I mean, what would you say, in your opinion, where are the most effective, or how are the most effective human rights program structured? Are they structured in a governance-centric or more strategic?
I would say that you have to comply. Compliance is the
Yeah.
foundation. Let's say, let's start with compliance, the foundation. We are not even discussing that. So you have to
Yes.
start
Okay.
there, right? Okay. Then we have some business that they want to go beyond, and some business that they will say just minimal requirements, compliance as a minimal, checking the boxes inside. That's all that I want as a company. However, I will recommend have a strategy as a vision. You don't have to start big. You have to start with complying. You have to start checking the boxes. However, if you want to measure, because you have to measure every year. What did work? What didn't work? How many cases did we have? How can we go down with the cases or go up, whatever? like you need to measure, and for measuring you need to have a strategy. And now the European legislation, like the European directive, they ask you to have and declare in your human rights policy what are your objectives. It's like the environmental ones, that
Yes.
we want to be, for example, zero, neutral zero, something like in the future. You have to do the same for human rights. For example, you need to have certain target. My target for the next 2 years will be to conduct, let's say, human rights due diligence to all my direct suppliers, let's say, as a target. Okay, and you need to try to meet that target, of course, because you promised already, and then move forward. Let's say in 5 years, I want to have full transparency of my indirect suppliers, at least first year, for example. If so, you need to have a strategy at the end of the day. You cannot just say like, I will just comply, because already compliance a lot. You cannot comply in the first year with everything. That is impossible. Like for any company, even those companies that have human rights team and human rights strategy the last 5 years, the amount of requirements coming in the future, like starting next year from the European Union, are incredible. Like so many. So it's even the compliance perspective, it will be like very difficult to achieve in just 1 year, for example, of implementation. So you need to prioritize, and you need to report that why you are not doing that. For example, your thing, because you are prioritizing this year, next year, and the minimal base, your blueprint, let's say, as a company. And then you will start with them. Also, you need to also communicate this and then make the entire human rights due diligence cycle and measure the effectiveness of your human rights implementation. As I said, so you can check what you did good, what didn't work, and implement that the next year with the changes to improve your program. So I would say compliance as the minimum for sure.
Yes.
But if you want to be smart, and if you want to, at the end of the day, actually comply with everything, because it's a lot, you need to have a strategy, and you need to communicate that strategy, that you are doing this slowly, because you are not obliged to do everything at the same time. You can prioritize, that is part of the law, and say this year this, next year the other, and that applies to own operation and also all your suppliers, direct suppliers as a minimum, and then indirect supplier in certain cases when you have like high risk suppliers, for example, they come from a high risk country.
High risk countries, yeah.
Or you have products or you have raw materials that are high risk. For example, if you have, let's say, coffee, cotton, wood, minerals, sugar, this kind of things, everybody knows that there are high risk kind of products. So, and raw materials. So it's something that you will have to check further.
Yeah, I think just you talking about that kind of prioritization, just because of the amount of duty that's on businesses to comply with all of this legislation. I mean, I think we consistently see businesses that say, okay, well, we've spoken about it in this conversation. 2029, it seems so far away, but I think in order to properly get ahead of this legislation, build robust human rights programs, if you're prioritizing against all of this wave of regulation, surely the time to start is now, if you haven't already.
Yes, for sure. It takes so much time to build the governance structures. It takes so much time to have even like your first policy, because you need to engage, you need to understand what are like the standards of the company, and then start with the implementation. But even like the first step of having a policy, it's like, this is like, let's say, your constitution as a company, right? So you need to really create that from scratch, understand what are your commitment as a company. And because you are publishing this in your website, so you are like claiming, and then claiming that you respect human rights, claiming that you have a management system, claiming all this kind of thing. So once you claim this, people can like of course, ask for accountability, right? So when you claim something, you already have to have the processes. So like the first implementation takes like pretty much like a year to have the policy and to have the processes. And then you start implementing, because you need to also train everybody. I will not say everybody in the company. Some people are not necessary to train, but most of the people, if you really want to implement this, everybody who in a company who treat or have any relationship with suppliers, with customers. Now the European Union is always asking about, like, it's not just about the supply chain, it's about also your customers and what kind of impact your product might have in your customers. So you need to engage with them as well. So everybody in the company who deal with suppliers or customer has to be trained, for example. Then people who deal with risk, because if you have, for example, let's say operational disruption based on a labor strike, that is human rights. And if that team do not understand why this is happening and how to solve it like very quickly, then you will have supply, like you will not get your products or the products that you did or your suppliers. So I think like it will take it 1 year, I would say, to have to start, and then slowly to implement every year. This is a very slowly process. It's year per year. So I will highly recommend that if your company is under any of this law, so under the scope of this law, especially the European ones, start sooner than later. Start
Absolutely.
small. You have to start small. There is nothing that you can do. You have to start small, but you have to start quickly.
Absolutely. And I think it's that implementation, as well as, to implement effectively, there has to be that education. And if you've got a business that hasn't got any knowledge base within human rights, and we're constantly seeing sustainability teams that are hired more under that E rather than that S, just looking completely confused at all of this legislation and how it affects human rights. They're just not in a position to be able to do that. So I think it's educating those sustainability teams just as much as the compliance and legal teams, as well as the general business. And like you said, it's not just people in the back office that you're having to educate. It's people that are interacting with customers on a day-to-day basis, as well as your entire supply chain. So it is a huge undertaking to make sure that you are compliant with these laws. So yeah, absolutely. And I suppose one final point, if I may, Constanza, is just around kind of your I suppose, assessment of the market sentiment of human rights at the moment. Do you think that human rights is growing in notoriety in the business community?
I would say it's highly increasing, and I would say that it's a business necessity today. Just because there's so many pressure from regulators at the moment, and also the pressure from the investors and the consumers. I think company now, they have to understand that this is not just a mandatory thing to comply with, it's a business necessity. And that if you implement this good, we'll have, at the end of the day, more revenues for the company as you imagine. If you have people think about the employers, okay? Most of them like to work in a company that aligns with their values. People today have especially young generation, values that are more sustainable. People are more sustainable. They recycle. They eat locally, for example, and this kind of things that they already have at home certain kind of sustainability approach. They don't use, for example, let's say I'm in Germany. Here, air condition, it's not part of the culture.
Yes,
it's not
same in the UK. You'd be surprised to know.
So here it's if you have air condition, it's pretty much oh, that's not sustainable. You will be social panish at some point, right? Mm-hmm. So there are so many sustainable measures already incorporated in your household, that people feel like that also when they go to a company and they work in a company that share the same values, right? So you have more, it will be easy to get talents. You will have more people for more years, more committed with the company. So it's this is a good revenue if you think about it. The same with consumers, the same with investors. Investors, think about the banks. banks today, they are not obliged, but they're like very pressured to offer ESG funds. ESG funds also perform very well. So one of the things, if you go to a bank and say, oh, you know what, I want to invest, the first thing that they will do is like, we have this and we have ESG funds. It's like, it's part of the offer because banks have to report on that. How that's something that they have to report every year, how they contribute to sustainable finance. So they will completely offer you the ESG fund. At the end of the day, for companies that align with the ESG requirement and report on them, will have more access to capital. The same with governance. You get, especially like in the UK, I know it's not mandatory, but every time that you want to sell something to the government, you get extra point for human rights compliance, environmental compliance. So
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yes. The same in Australia. Many governments, when it's public procurement, so you need to get an offer. You need to offer something to the government when you want to sell them to them. So there's the minimal requirement, and there are like plus points. And when you have like for example, you have the modern slavery statement, okay? But then you get more plus point if you have a policy, if you have, for example, a management system, that if you can like really like present evidence of what you are doing, if you conduct that training, then you get more points. And when you get more points, it's more possible to get the deal done with the government, to be chosen as the supplier. So each of those governments, it's not yet implemented in Germany, but I know in the UK it's implemented and Australia as well. So public procurement gives you extra point when you have ESG/human rights compliance in a good level, and you are able to demonstrate it. So I would say like the market, and as we said, like the pressure of civil society as well. The market sentiment, it's more about like, let's move forward with this. I can see that. Of course, there's pushback. There will be always pushback. But it's something that will happen. It's like the same with data protection in Europe years ago.
Yes.
People were like, I don't understand why we are doing this. This is not applied to us. And today, everybody knows about data protection. Try to take a picture in a public. It's almost impossible.
I'm scared these days to take a picture anywhere in public. It terrifies me that someone will take issue with it, so I tend not to do it. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think
people
that
know
should.
Their rights. People
they
will
do.
Approach you and say like, don't take a picture of me.
Yes. I'm going all red. The Britishness in me is making me stressed out at the prospect of offending somebody. So, but yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think we are seeing continual growth in human rights conversations within businesses. They may be hiring with specific human rights mandates or broader sustainability mandates that actually properly include that S rather than looking at their environmental commitments. So yeah, I think it's certainly encouraging.
They are also related. If you think about human rights and the ESG, and then a broader aspect. Human rights is pretty much the S. This is the entire S. When you think about labor rights, human rights in the supply chain, and then you have the community impact and consumer protection. That are like let's say the new KPIs for ESG coming from the reporting directive. You have to focus on that. If you don't focus on that, you cannot report. You cannot comply with the new regulations. So the human rights are like part of this ESG environment, and also are like completely related. If you think about environmental impact, it's human rights impact at the end of the day. If you contaminate the river, you are contaminating the people around that river. You are like making that people sick. So if you contaminate the environment, you are contaminating the people who live in that environment. So one impact will impact the other. So environmental. Let's think about climate change, all these tornadoes and kind of things. At the end of the day, climate change has an impact on people. It's not just an impact on the environment, it's impact on people. So your company, it's better not to be related to them, right? So as a company, if you can say our impact is pretty much zero or it's neutral, we don't have any impact like adverse impact on people, adverse impact on the environment, that's pretty much good news for you, for yourselves, for you as a company, for your brand. And the opposite means fines, legal liability, brand reputation. I would say like it's good business to take care about ESG, to take care about the S, also like the social compliance, and the only thing that a company has to do is to measure the risk and avoid impact. You don't have to be like the best. You don't have to be like Captain Planet. That is not the
Yeah.
mandatory thing to do for a company. The mandatory thing to do for a company is to identify the risk and take measures to avoid impact. It's as simple as I said. Just identify the risk, take measure to avoid impact. That's all.
Excellent. Well, I mean, thank you so much, Constanza, for doing this. I mean, this has been insightful for me. I hope it's been insightful for, I say, all of you watching at home, like we're live or something like that. And now I want to say subscribe below, but I have no idea if we have that feature. So subscribe below, people. But thank you very much, Constanza. It's been really insightful, and thank you very much for taking the time.
No, thanks for the invitation. It was super fun. So thanks for the opportunity. And yeah.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.